will do a painting based on this reference photo. Here are the brushes I use. This is my palette, and for today's painting I am mainly using Mars Yellow Flesh Tint. It has a whitish tone in it, like flesh, from Windsor and Newton, and raw sienna, burnt sienna, alizarin crimson, Payne's gray, French ultramarine, cobalt blue, and a little bit sap green, and also here lavender from Hobein. Let's get started. So first I will just do a very simple sketch. I just want to mark the horizon and the distant mountains and the grassland in the foreground. You do not need to be very accurate in your drawing. That's not the point of this practice. And you don't need to press very hard with your pencil. You just want to create an outline and give yourself a sense of direction. You can use a kneaded eraser to erase some of the excessive lines that you made so as to keep the sketch simple and clean. The sketch is done, just like this. Actually, I forgot to mention, there's another paint that I use, which is transparent orange. I just purchased this and I didn't put it in my palette. Now I'm adding it. So first of all, I am wetting the paper with my Haki brush with clean water. You want to wet your paper very thoroughly. I'm using a block, so I only need to wet one surface. And make sure you wet the corners, just wet it evenly. So now I'm taking a 3/4 inch flat brush and I'm using some Mars Yellow and a little bit transparent orange. Also a little bit flesh tint to tone it down. I'm trying to reach this color that is a little bit orange but yellow. That is the lightest part in the lower sky. Now I'm going to apply it. As you can see, the pigment just spreads because the paper is wet. And because the paper is wet, you can go a little bit stronger in your pigment, because when it dries, it will be much lighter. Remember not to paint the part where the setting sun is. Now I'm going to mix the color for the upper part of the sky with a little bit of the yellow and a little bit of lavender and French ultramarine. It's a little bit dry, so added some water. And then I also added a little bit alizarin crimson to make it a little bit purplish. So now I'm just applying it to the upper part of the paper and making sure to connect with the lower part of the sky, which is yellow, so that they achieve a smooth transition between each other. But don't worry about it, because eventually we have to paint the dark cloud. Now I'm basically mixing the same mixture but with more French ultramarine and alizarin crimson to make it more blue and purplish, and I'm applying to the sky. and also started to go down. Now I'm switching to my round brush and making a darker orange, and I paint the orange part of the sky. You don't have to follow the reference photo strictly. You know, it is the sky and it changes all the time, so feel free to create some variations. But here you have to leave out a more accurate shape of the setting sun, because this is actually the darkest part of the orange sky. And I'm also adding orange to the upper part of the sky, because if you take a good look at the reference photo, you can see some of the clouds on the top actually have some orange silver lining. So now I'm carefully leaving out the shape of the setting sun in white, and trying to make the part around the sky even stronger in the pigment. Just make sure each layer you use less water so that it doesn't create background or cauliflower. Now I'm taking some French Ultramarine, some transparent orange, and Alizarin crimson to make a purplish brown color, and I'm going to paint the dark clouds. Because this dark mixture has all the color that I used previously to paint the sky, it actually transitions with the rest of the colors very well. And make sure this mixture is quite dry, because the paper is damp, and if this layer is wetter than the paper, then it will create background like cauliflower effects that you don't want to see. So make sure you dry up your brush when you wash it before you make this mixture. I'm only loosely following the reference photo. Feel free to change up. See, when I dip it in water, I always dry it with tissues before dipping it into the paint. Also trying to make the shape of the cloud change here and there, because you know it's nature, so it's not very static, so you want to make sure the clouds are in different shapes and combinations. As long as your paper is still damp, you can create this effect where the clouds are a little bit fuzzy. But once it's dry, then it's difficult to create this effect. I'm checking whether the upper part of the sky is still damp. It's still a little bit damp, not as damp as I wish it to be because I live in a heated apartment. So I need to hurry up and paint the upper part of the sky in the same manner. So make sure to paint the clouds where you made those orange silver lining so that it doesn't look weird. You only want to add more color when the paper is still damp. But actually now I can see that my paper is not really damp enough for me to create this smooth transition between different colors. And this is the time to stop. Okay, the sky is done, and let's move on to the distant mountains, the water, and the foreground grassland. Now I'm making a dark mixture by adding burnt umber to the previous dark mixture, as well as more French ultramarine and a little bit Payne's gray to make it darker. The paper is still damp, so hopefully it will create a fuzzy effect that looks like distant mountains. And here you want to make sure that the paper is not too wet, because if it's too wet, then it might bloom. So you really need to pay attention to your environment. Now I'm just making some suggestive brush strokes to symbolize distant buildings or trees and trying to make them variant. If you look at the reference photo, you can see the part that's underneath the setting sun is actually quite orange. So now I'm adding more transparent orange. And you can just use transparent orange almost out of the tube. You want it very saturated. Now we are moving to the water. So I am going to paint the reflection of the sky. So it's basically the same mixture of the yellowish orange tone. But I decided to re-wet the paper again because it's really drying up. Just make sure not to touch the paint of the mountains. So you basically leave a little bit gap between the part you wetted and the distant mountains. And here you don't even need to use clean water, like any water that's left in your water tub is fine. So now I'm mixing basically the same mixture of orange, and follow the reference photo. I just loosely paint it in the water where it is directly underneath the setting sun. And you can go overboard because eventually I will mix it with the blue paint. So now I'm taking some French Ultramarine, a little bit burnt on Sienna, to make a grayish blue. Also add a little bit of orange. And then I'm painting the rest part of the water. And be extra careful with the distant mountain. You want them to connect, but don't paint over it too much. Since I re-wetted the paper, now the colors are blending with each other very well again. And here you don't need to worry about the foreground because the foreground is much darker and which will be on top of these paints. So you can paint across the entire paper. Now I'm just making sure there are no gaps left between the mountains and the body of water. Okay, now I am going to make the mixture for the foreground grassland, I think. So I'm using burnt sienna, French ultramarine, and add a little bit sap green because I want some greenish tone shines through. I don't want it to be completely pitch dark. So now I'm just following the outline that I sketched at the beginning and to paint the shape of the land. Here it is good that the surface is damp because you actually want the more distant part of the land to look a little bit fuzzy. And also make sure this paint is also quite dry so that you don't create background of cauliflower. Now I'm making the mixture even darker. And then I'm going to paint it over what I just painted. and even darker. Because the paper is damp, so it always dries up lighter. Now I'm going to add some details to the grassland. I will use this synthetic fan brush, which is great to paint grass. So I'm just going to use it to pick up the same mixture, and I'm just going to brush it upwards. I'm going to zoom in. As you can see, it creates a very soft effect of grass. My brush is very dry, so I'm just picking up a little bit more color. And I try to move the brush in different direction, so that your grass look like they are wavering in the wind. This is a very cheap brush. I just use a knife to sharpen the end, and I use it to scrape off some of the paint to create some grass that is lit by the sun. And you want to make sure when you do this, the paper is not very wet. When it's very wet, it won't create this effect. If you don't have that, you can also use your fingernails, but the lines created by fingernails will be a little bit thicker. So actually you can use both. Or you can use any other sharp material that you can think of. Just experiment. So here is the end result. Hope you enjoyed it.